So I'm going to start just by very quickly talking about what humanism is, what the word humanist today is used to mean. And the word humanist started having its present meaning at the end of the 19th century to capture and describe a set of beliefs and values and attitudes that already existed. Many weighty volumes and words have been written about humanism as an approach to life. I'm just going to give you some quick indication of the essentials of the core of what this word means. So humanists are people who accept naturalism, accept that the universe is a natural phenomenon. There's no second layer to reality where there might be goblins and demons and ghosts and gods and genies and so on and so forth. And as a result of that conviction, use the scientific method as the way of gaining knowledge about the world around us. People who, partly as a consequence of that, accept that all the evidence indicates that this life, this present life that we're experiencing here and now, is the only life we know we have. And it's fruitless to waste time hypothesizing some future condition, some other existence in which we might go on or persist in some way after physical death. Humanists are people who accept that morality, what we with our conscious minds have called morality and developed as morality, is something that wasn't imported or gifted into human beings at some historical moment by some external force on tablets of stone or by any sort of god, but is something that is itself an artifact of human beings' relationships with one another, something that's generated from within humanity's interactions with other human beings. Morality is something that arises out of human nature and human culture, not something that is the product of external constraints or coercion or forces or divine guidance, such as characterizes the view of morality of many religions in the world. Humanists are people who believe that what is right, the measure of the rightness or the wrongness of an action or a decision, a choice, has something to do with human welfare and fulfillment. So the test of rightness isn't the extent to which you're living up in correspondence to some external rule, someone else's authority, some other ultimate cosmic plan written into the universe, but instead the test of rightness or wrongness, the morality of an action, should be measured according to its effects on people and other animals in the here and now. And humanists are people who believe that in the absence of any discernible purpose, trajectory, or point to the universe, that it's human beings who can and do and should create meaning and purpose here and now in our own lives, ourselves, and for each other. So if you want to view those 5 quick beliefs and values as a sort of Venn diagram, in the middle of which is what is described today by the word humanism, then that might be a helpful device. The way I want to relate that to the idea of evolution by natural selection is just to pause for a moment and think about where these ideas of humanism have appeared in the world before the present time. Because the important thing about a humanist view is that there never was a Mr. Human after whom this attitude is named, and made it up, wrote it down, and spread it out. These ideas aren't confined to any one particular place, any one particular culture, any one particular time. They are ideas that have been arrived at, conclusions that have been reached again and again across the world and at all times. We find these ideas that I've just described held in combination in the ancient world in Europe. For 1,200 years, they were very much a part of the mental landscape of men and women living in this part of the world. We find these ideas 2,500 years ago in China, in the people who followed on from the philosopher Confucius. And for thousands of years, the huge majority of people in the world who lived in China followed, for example, a morality that had nothing to do with any sort of God or divine commandments, but everything to do with the prudential rules for governing social interactions, a very this-worldly morality. We find these ideas at that same time, 25 centuries ago, in the southernmost tip of India, where there was a school of classical Indian materialists called the Charvakas, who said that this life was the only life we had, that priests were all liars and frauds, that, the right thing to do if you wanted to live your life with some purpose was to enjoy this life, find fulfillment, and help others to do the same. We find these ideas in what in Europe were the Middle Ages in the Arab world, And we find these ideas in the Western world in the last few centuries and globally, of course, today. But the thing that has made this broad approach to life called humanism so much more powerful and influential and mainstream today as an implicit idea, if not as an explicit word, but certainly as an implicit attitude, is to a large part the discoveries in the 19th century that we've been talking about for the rest of today, and which we'll go on to carry on talking about when I finished my little plug. Because the discovery of the mechanism of natural selection and the theory of evolution that it underpins, and the understanding that human beings are a part of that process or a product of that process, gives people who adopt a humanist attitude to the world and to questions of value and meaning the missing piece that in previous centuries they were denied. And I want to indicate that very briefly by picking out some of the people who had humanist views a long, long time ago, 25 centuries or more ago, without knowing anything about evolution by natural selection. This is not a contemporary portrait, obviously, since this is the reflection of a classical Indian materialist who lived 2,500 years ago and is quoted here in a later work, but it's quoted back to the 3rd century BCE, so 2,300 years ago. Who paints the peacocks? Who makes the cuckoos sing? There is no cause here other than nature. And you may have read the Gita if you've been foolish enough to have stopped when offered a free copy in the street by Hare Krishnas. Often they like to do this thing. And if you've read it, you may be familiar with it as one of the foundational texts of theistic Hinduism today. Well, there's a line in the Gita that sets out to refute these classical Indian materialists, and it does so in saying, if it's true that it's only nature that's responsible for all the wondrous diversity that we see around us and for human beings themselves, then why isn't there any plausible account of how it happened? Why isn't there a mechanism? So we see humanists 2,500 years ago in India are stymied in their case for naturalism by not being able to point to a mechanism that accounts for diversity around us. If you look at some humanists from the classical European period, Marcus Aurelius, for example, he wants to make the case, as do all Stoics at the time, that human beings are all from one common source, that rather than human beings being separately created races that are different from each other, we all descend from one common source. But again, that case for the unity of humanity, the actual and moral unity of humanity, is undermined because it can't be justified. There's no reason, no plausible mechanism that can explain how that can be the case when human beings, after all, look so different from each other, in fact. Here's an Arab biologist, Al-Jahith, from the 8th century, so moving a bit more into the modern period, who wrote a book saying that the forms of animals develop naturally and possibly one from each other, so dogs from wolves and so on and so forth. But because he wasn't aware of the mechanism by which that could happen, he had no hope of extending it either to animals generally or, more importantly, to human beings, and so no hope for building a really firm case that human nature was a product also of natural selection. And here's a picture of the Chinese philosopher Mencius from 3rd century BCE in China. Like David Hume 1,700 years later, he made the case from observation and experience that the origin of morality, rather than being divine sanctions or external forces, was actually the social instincts that were in us. The feeling of commiseration is the beginning of humanity, he said. The feeling of shame and dislike is the beginning of righteousness. And he tries really hard in his humanistic thinking to build the case that morality, far from something that comes from external sources, is something that comes from within human beings living in society. But when pushed to explain how this happens, what the evidence for this is, any overwhelming or convincing mechanism that could indicate that this is the case, he can't give it. So those of us who have humanist attitudes today, humanist opinions on questions of values and meaning and existence, are much more better equipped to mount a persuasive case for those values, much more better equipped to overcome the different opposition to those propositions being true than anyone who's ever lived with these values at any point in human history anywhere in the world before now. What does the British Humanist Association do? Well, founded in 1896, it now has 30,000 members and supporters, 13 staff and 90 volunteers in London. We have policies informed by 120 scientists, philosophers and other thinkers, various local and special interest affiliate groups, various volunteers working on the ground, and 500,000 people a year attend one of the funerals or other ceremonies that are conducted by our trained celebrants. We do a lot of education work, mainly online. We also train and send speakers into schools to talk about humanism and other non-religious approaches to life, often as a counterweight to the education about religions that they receive. We produce resources for those courses to occur in the wider community, as well as in schools. We provide certain sorts of community services. I alluded briefly to our trained and accredited celebrants who conduct those funerals for non-religious people, other ceremonies such as weddings. In Scotland, legal humanist marriages have just overtaken Roman Catholic marriages to be only the second most popular marriage in that whole country. The ceremonies in England are growing in popularity every year, and we also provide some schemes of pastoral support for non-religious prisoners in prisons and patients in hospitals on a voluntary basis to give the same sort of support to non-religious people that some religious people receive from state-funded chaplains. In public affairs, we campaign for secularism in law and government. We're the largest organisation doing that in the UK, one of the largest in Europe. But we also campaign on ethical issues from a humanist perspective. We're the only national organisation to be campaigning for assisted dying for people who are incurably suffering, like in the recent cases of people like Paul Lamb and Tony Nicholson that you may have seen in the media. We're the only people supporting those cases. We campaign by working with the all-party Parliamentary Humanist Group, which is over 110 MPs and peers in Parliament, and with special interest groups that provide us with support like Lawyers for Humanism. And we have 27 different current campaigns that are more or less active at any one time, depending on the external circumstances. Faith schools, obviously that's always a big one. We're against them, not for them, clearly. Worship in schools, yeah, we're against that too. The school curriculum, we're in favour of a school curriculum, but at odds with the present government and with quite a few governing bodies about what it should contain. Bishops in the Lords, that's campaigning obviously for a fair and secular constitutional system in this country. And then there are new challenges, like the current phenomenon of contracting out previously secular public services to religious groups, which can then discriminate very often in both employment and provision as a result. Free speech issues, the abolition of the blasphemy laws 7 years ago, but today fighting against the almost reintroduction of blasphemy laws by the back door in advertising regulation and other outside extra-legal problems, and ethical issues like assisted dying that I mentioned earlier. I think that those challenges are amongst some of the most serious social and political challenges domestically that face us today. We are totally dependent on individuals' moral and financial support in order to continue this work. I know there's a new branch setting up here in Bristol. I hope that those of you who are from Bristol will get involved in that and give it your support. And I hope all the rest of you join the BHA to support its work, but more importantly, enjoy the rest of today, enjoy the Ancestors Trail, and enjoy the walk and the rest of the talks that you'll be hearing. Thank you very much.